That morning, I discovered someone was using my private driveway as if it were a public road, and what shocked me was not the fresh tire tracks pressed into the gravel, but how many there were. They crisscrossed and overlapped, as if that road had never belonged to me at all. I stood there for several minutes in the thin morning mist, a cup of coffee still steaming in my hand. I had hired a crew to build that driveway 15 years ago. Every layer of gravel was compacted tight. Every inch lay entirely within my property line. It led nowhere except to my wooden house at the end of the hill. And yet now, it looked like a convenient shortcut for the entire new neighborhood behind the line of pine trees. At first, it was just one unfamiliar SUV. I assumed they had taken a wrong turn. I am not the kind of person who gets upset over a small mistake. 22 years in the military taught me that a rushed reaction is usually the wrong reaction. But one vehicle turned into 3. 3 became 10. Then 15 cars every morning, cutting across the space in front of my house, crushing the gravel, kicking up clouds of dust. I did not yell. I did not run out to block the road. I simply installed additional cameras. 3 days later, I reviewed all the footage. Every single vehicle had turned in from the newly built subdivision, a neighborhood managed by an HOA that had been established less than 6 months earlier. I had read more than a few HOA stories and Karen stories online. Reddit stories packed with scenes of overreaching neighbors, HOA presidents who acted like they ruled the world. I always read them as an outsider. It was almost ironic to realize that now I was living inside my own HOA Karen story. That afternoon I drove down to the HOA office, a temporary prefabricated building set up near the entrance of the subdivision. I stepped inside. The smell of fresh paint was still heavy in the air. The woman behind the desk looked up. Neatly cut hair, lips pressed tight, eyes sharp and cold. She introduced herself as the president of the board. Her voice was polished, polite to the point of being icy. I asked her directly, why were her residents using my private driveway? She smiled. It was only a temporary access route for convenience, she said, until the main road was completed, for the benefit of the community. For the benefit of the community. I reminded her that the road sat entirely on my land. She responded with a sentence that made it clear this would not be simple. She said the area had always been considered shared access, that I should be flexible. I looked her straight in the eye and asked about the easement paperwork. She avoided the question. There was no specific document, she admitted, but everyone understood. Everyone understood. I left the office without raising my voice. On the drive home, I thought about the people in that subdivision. Maybe they believed I was just an old man living alone on a hill. Someone easy to persuade, or easy to ignore. They had no idea who I was. That evening, I opened my safe. I took out the property documents, the survey maps, the certificate of ownership, the boundary markers stamped in red by the county. Everything was as clear as daylight. There was not a single easement granted to the HOA. I sat there reading every line. Slowly, calmly. Outside, another vehicle drove across my driveway. Its headlights swept across my living room window as if I did not exist. I was not angry. I was taking notes. The next day, I installed a larger sign at the entrance of the driveway. Private property, no HOA access. Black letters on a white background, impossible to miss. By late afternoon, I received the first email from the HOA president. The tone was smooth, but the threat was there beneath the surface. She claimed I was obstructing community traffic. She said they would consider legal action if I refused to cooperate. I read that email twice. Then I smiled. They thought I was reacting emotionally. They did not know I had spent more than 2 decades planning operations in situations far more complex than this. They did not know I understood this county's property laws almost by heart. They did not know I had commanded missions where one wrong move cost lives. A private driveway? To me, it was a matter of principle. That night, I reviewed all the camera footage again. I logged the dates, the times, the license plates. I did not stop them. Not yet. Because I knew that if you want to deal with a Karen, you do not need to shout. You simply let them believe they are winning. And then, when they go too far, you close the gate. The red pickup truck tore past my warning sign as if it did not exist. And behind the wheel was the HOA president's husband. I stood in my kitchen, watching through the camera monitor as the tires crushed the edge of the newly planted grass. It was not an accident. It's not a wrong turn. It was a statement. The next morning, I drove back to the HOA office. No notice, no appointment. I walked in while their internal meeting was in progress. 6 people sat around the table, and she was at the head of it, her eyes cold as steel. I placed a stack of printed photos from my camera on the table. The license plate was clear. The timestamps were clear. I spoke slowly, stating that the trespassing had been documented. I requested an official written confirmation of their right to use the driveway, if they believed they had one. She leaned back in her chair. Her voice was sweet but sharp. She said I was overreacting, that the community was growing, that my driveway helped reduce traffic on the main road, that I should think about the greater good. Another board member let out a quiet laugh. He looked at me as if I were an aging man clinging desperately to a few meters of land. In that moment, I saw exactly what they were thinking. They saw me as isolated, no family, no influence. A man living alone on a hill, disconnected from the expanding new neighborhood below. They did not know. I pulled from my briefcase a copy of my property ownership certificate, the county stamped survey map. I laid each document on the table, unhurried. I pointed to the boundary lines. The driveway lay entirely within my land. No easement, no temporary agreement, no clause granting the HOA any right of access. The room fell silent for several seconds. Then she said something that made me understand their strategy. She claimed the old records might not fully reflect recent zoning adjustments, that my parcel had once been considered for traffic connectivity, that the community had the right to renegotiate. I looked her straight in the eye and asked whether they had any officially approved zoning documents from the county. She did not answer directly. Instead, she mentioned that if I continued to obstruct access, the HOA might consider legal measures for negatively impacting residents. It was no longer a suggestion. It was a threat. I left the meeting without raising my voice, but that very evening, I did something they did not expect. I called the county land records office, not to ask questions, but to confirm the archived microfilm records from the 1970s. I requested a full copy of the property history, dating back to before that subdivision even existed. 2 days later, I held a thick file in my hands. Yellowed pages, old seals, signatures of men who had long since passed away. And buried in those documents was a detail even I had nearly forgotten. The driveway was not just personal property. It was part of the parcel I inherited from my father, a Korean War veteran. The record clearly stated exclusive use for the owner, with no transfer of access rights without notarized documentation. I returned to the HOA office once more, this time carrying the complete legal history of the land. I did not go alone. With me was a man in a gray suit, quiet, sharp-eyed. He did not introduce himself at length. He simply placed his business card on the table. A legal consultant specializing in property ownership rights. The atmosphere in the room shifted immediately. The looks that once carried quiet contempt now turned cautious. The HOA president tried to remain composed, but her voice had lost its polished edge. I spoke slowly, stating that all unauthorized use had been documented, that if it continued, I would file a formal trespassing complaint, that I was fully prepared to have the county review their entire subdivision project. In that moment, I saw the truth register in her eyes. She realized I was not some outdated old man. I did not just own the land. I had the records. I had the law. And I had the patience to see this through to the end. On the drive home, I noticed an unusual silence. No more tires rushing over gravel. But I knew this was not the end. Because people like her do not retreat easily. They believe in the power of the collective. They believe the majority can crush an individual. What they did not understand was that I have never fought with the backing of a crowd. I fight from the ground I stand on. My warning sign was snapped in half in the middle of the night. and the camera captured the face of the man holding the hammer. 12:41 in the morning. Headlights sliced across the driveway like a cold blade. The man stepped out of a black SUV. No mask, no hurry. He smashed the private property sign until the wooden post tore loose from the ground, then tossed it into the ditch. I sat in front of the monitor, replaying every frame in silence. They thought I would lose my temper, that I would storm down into the subdivision, pounding on doors, that I would turn into the bitter old man from the Karen stories they used to read and laugh about. But I did not. The next morning, I put up another sign, bigger, steel post instead of wood, clearer lettering, and beneath it, I added one more line, area under continuous video recording. By noon, I received a formal invitation to attend the full HOA meeting, not a private email. An official letter, stamped by the board. The subject line read, Community Access Dispute. I knew they were preparing a performance. The meeting was held at the newly built community hall. Folding chairs arranged in rows. About 40 residents in attendance. Many curious eyes. A few irritated ones. Some whispering that I was the troublemaker. The president stood to speak. Her voice echoed through the microphone, steady but layered with implication. She said the community was growing rapidly. That cooperation among households was essential. That one individual was obstructing traffic for personal reasons. I sat in the back row, silent. A man stood up and said his wife now had to take a 10-minute detour every morning since I put up the sign, that it affected their work. A young woman said she felt intimidated by the camera pointed toward the access path. I listened to everything. No rebuttal, no interruption. Then the president invited me to speak. I walked up slowly. I did not take the microphone right away. Instead, I placed a thick file on the table in front of them. Survey maps, copies of the land history, color photographs of the SUV smashing my sign, the timestamp clearly visible. The room began to murmur. I said I was not against the community. I was protecting my lawful property. I projected the cadastral map onto the screen, the boundary lines marked in bold red. The driveway lay entirely within it. Several residents began glancing toward the president. She stood again, trying to regain control. She said that according to information the board had received from the developer, my parcel had once been proposed for integration into the internal traffic system. That this was a misunderstanding rooted in the past. Proposed. I opened another page in the file. An official document from the county confirming that no zoning changes had ever been approved. I stated clearly that any use without a lawful easement constituted trespassing. The atmosphere in the room shifted. The people who had looked at me as if I were the problem now fell quiet. Then I revealed the detail they did not expect. I said I had already submitted the full documentation and video footage to the county planning office for review to determine whether this subdivision was in full compliance with its original approval records. A heavy silence settled over the room. I saw a flicker of concern cross the president's face. She was no longer the confident woman directing the crowd. She was calculating. An older resident stood up and asked whether this could affect their property values if the project came under investigation. That was the moment the balance of power shifted. I did not need to shout. I did not need to threaten. I only needed them to understand that this was no longer about a temporary shortcut. It was a legal issue that could expand far beyond a driveway. The president announced that the meeting would be temporarily adjourned so the board could review the matter further. Her voice was no longer steady. As I walked out of the community hall, several people followed me. A middle-aged man said he had not realized the situation was this complicated. A woman said she had assumed the HOA had a legal agreement. They were beginning to doubt. That evening, my phone rang. Not from the president, from another board member. His voice was low and cautious. He asked whether there was a way to resolve the matter privately, to avoid county involvement. I could hear the fear in his tone. They thought I was just a stubborn old man guarding a few meters of gravel. They did not know I was accustomed to studying tactical maps and identifying weaknesses. I told him the solution was simple. They stop using the driveway immediately and send written confirmation. The call ended in silence. Outside, the sky darkened. No more engines cutting across my yard. but I knew this was only the first round. Because when power is challenged, it does not disappear. It strikes back. And I was ready. That morning, they were no longer sneaking around. They brought a concrete truck straight onto my driveway. The engine roared through the early mist. Heavy tires crushed the gravel I had compacted over so many years. I stood on my porch, arms folded across my chest, watching every movement like a man observing a battlefield. This was no longer a misunderstanding. This was an open challenge. The first truck stopped right in the middle of the drive. 2 workers stepped out and began placing stakes to mark the area. I walked slowly down the slope. No rush, no raised voice. I asked what they were doing on my land. One of them replied that they had been hired by the HOA to widen the temporary access, preparing to pour a thin layer of concrete to make traffic easier. He spoke as if the decision had been made long ago. I asked to see the construction permit. They looked at each other. There was none. I called the HOA president right there on the spot, she answered. Her tone was calm to the point of disbelief. She said the board had voted to improve the access road for the benefit of the community, that it fell within their authority. Authority. I asked again about the easement, about the building permit, about county approval. She said I was deliberately making things difficult, that if I continued interfering with the project, they would consider suing me for disrupting community operations. I ended the call. I did not stop the workers immediately. I simply asked them to wait a few minutes. I went inside and retrieved the most recent survey file. 3 days earlier, I had hired an independent surveyor to confirm the boundary lines once again. My instincts are rarely wrong. When the surveyor finished, he had driven small steel stakes along the property line. They sat just a few inches from the edge of the driveway. Clear. Impossible to mistake. I brought the map out in front of the construction crew. I pointed to the freshly placed steel markers. I told them that if they poured concrete beyond that line, they would be building illegally on private property. One of the 2 workers hesitated. The other called the site manager. The conversation lasted several minutes. I heard words like liability and permit. 15 minutes later, the truck started its engine and pulled away. But the story did not end there. That afternoon, I received a notice from the HOA. They accused me of intentionally obstructing infrastructure improvements for the neighborhood. They demanded that I attend an internal hearing within 7 days. I read the letter twice. The ink was still fresh, the tone heavy with collective authority. They believed that the pressure of the crowd would make me step back. They did not know I had faced far greater pressure before. That evening, I drove to the county planning office, not to complain, to file a formal request for inspection regarding the HOA attempting improvements on land they did not own. The clerk receiving my documents studied me carefully. When I handed over the survey and the video footage of the concrete truck preparing to begin work, his expression changed. He said that if this was accurate, the subdivision project could be in violation of its original approval conditions. I nodded. I did not need to say more. 2 days later, a county inspector appeared at the subdivision. A pickup truck bearing the government logo parked directly in front of the HOA office. I stood on the hill watching from above. Even at a distance, I saw the president step outside, her face tight with tension. The discussion lasted nearly an hour. I could not hear what they were saying, but I saw the way she crossed her arms defensively, then flipped through files in haste. That afternoon, my phone rang. The voice on the other end was no longer proud. It was lower, cautious. She requested a private meeting to discuss a possible resolution. I agreed to meet, but not at the HOA office. I chose a small cafe outside of town, a place without a crowd to stand behind her. When she sat across from me, I saw for the first time that she was looking at me as a real opponent. No longer a solitary old man, no longer a troublemaker. She asked what I wanted. I answered simply. I wanted them to stop using the driveway, to cancel all construction plans, and to send an official written commitment. She fell silent for several seconds. In her eyes, I saw the struggle between pride and reality. She understood that if the county expanded its investigation, everything could spiral beyond control. I did not need to threaten her. I simply repeated that I would defend my property rights to the end. As she left the cafe, I realized something. They were beginning to understand that I was not someone they could pressure into submission. And when a community accustomed to imposing its will meets an individual who refuses to bend, the balance of power begins to shift. Slowly, but inevitably, they voted publicly to continue using my driveway. And they did it right in front of me. The community hall was packed. The air felt thick, like the moment before a storm breaks. The president stood at the podium, a stack of papers in her hand, her voice ringing out clearly. She said the board had reviewed every aspect and determined that continuing to use the access road was necessary for the convenience of the community during this transitional period. I sat in the second row, back straight, calm. Many eyes were fixed on me, waiting for a reaction. Some thought I would lose my temper. Some hoped I would say something they could nod along to. I said nothing. A board member read the voting proposal. Maintain temporary access rights. Continue negotiating with the landowner. The landowner. They did not use my name. As if I were a legal concept, not a person. Hands went up. 1, 2, 3. The majority. The gavel struck the table. The decision was passed. A few scattered claps echoed through the room. Not because they were happy, but because they believed they had just affirmed collective power. The president turned toward me. Her eyes carried a challenge. She said the board hoped I would cooperate for the greater good rather than create further division. I stood up and walked forward. My footsteps echoed evenly across the wooden floor, each step a quiet declaration that I was not afraid of a crowd. I did not argue about feelings. I did not speak about morality. I simply placed a large envelope on the table. Inside was a copy of the formal complaint I had filed with the county, along with a request for a comprehensive review of the HOA's use of land beyond its approved boundaries. The room went silent. I spoke slowly, stating that their decision did not alter lawful ownership, and that any continued unauthorized use after this notice would be considered intentional trespassing. A man in the back row jumped to his feet. He said I was threatening the entire community, that I was making things more complicated than necessary. I looked at him. In his eyes, I saw not hatred, but worry. He feared his home value might be affected. He feared his mortgage. He feared instability. The president tried to regain control. She said they had legal counsel advising them, that they believed the use of the access road fell within the collective rights outlined in the subdivision's development charter. I asked her one question. Was that charter signed by me? There was no answer. I left the meeting as whispers began spreading like an undercurrent. I heard a few people say they had not realized the situation was this serious. Someone mentioned the word audit. Someone else said liability. That night, my phone received more calls than usual. Some residents wanted clarification. Some simply wanted reassurance that I had no intention of collapsing the entire project. I gave them all the same answer. I was not against anyone. I was protecting what belonged to me. But they still believed I was just a small individual trying to fight an entire system. What they did not know was that I had once sat in strategic meeting rooms where decisions affected thousands of people. I had learned how to read maps, read people, and read the silence between words. The next morning, I received official notice from the county. They would conduct a review of the current land use within the next 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Enough time for concern to spread through the subdivision. Enough time for conversations at kitchen tables to shift from landscaping to legal matters. That afternoon, I stood on my porch, looking down the slope. A car approached the entrance to my driveway, slowed, turned its wheel, made a U-turn. Then another car did the same. No gate, no fence, just the certainty that I would not back down. On the other side of the hill, I knew the president was calculating her next move. She was not used to being challenged, not used to a man she had underestimated having enough documentation, enough knowledge, and enough patience to make the entire system hesitate. This fight was not over. But for the first time, they understood that I was not a minor obstacle on their path to development. I was the boundary. They sent me a letter threatening a lawsuit. and they sent it by certified mail, as if a red stamp could make me tremble. I opened the envelope on my kitchen table under the pale yellow light. The language was firm. The arguments stretched on. They accused me of causing financial damage to the community, disrupting traffic flow, affecting construction progress. They demanded that I remove the warning signs and allow access during the time the dispute was being resolved. I finished reading it, folded the letter, set it down. Then I smiled, because just as they thought I was on the defensive, I had already moved to the next phase. 3 days earlier, I had filed the paperwork to install an automatic gate exactly at my property line, not a temporary barrier. A solid steel gate with concrete pillars and a remote control system. Completely lawful, entirely within the rights of a property owner. The next morning, a truck carrying materials pulled up in front of my house. 2 steel posts were set into place. The concrete drill screamed, its sharp sound tearing through the quiet air. From the other side of the hill, I saw a few residents standing and watching. One of them held up a phone to record. Rumors spread faster than the wind. The HOA president arrived about an hour later. She stepped out of her car, high heels sinking slightly into the gravel. Her eyes no longer hid her anger. She asked what I was doing. I answered simply, I was protecting my property. She said installing the gate would completely block the temporary traffic flow, that I was acting in bad faith while the dispute had not yet been resolved. I handed her a copy of the building permit issued by the county. The red seal was clear, the signature complete. She took the paper, stared at it for a few seconds, then handed it back. She said the board would consider urgent legal action to stop me. I nodded, told her I had prepared for every scenario as well. She did not know that I was not just a veteran living quietly on a hill. Before retiring, I had worked as a strategic consultant for a major regional infrastructure development company. I understood how projects were approved, how permits functioned, and how a small flaw in documentation could stall an entire development. I had never mentioned that in any meeting. They thought I only had emotion. They did not know I had experience. The installation took 2 days. The black steel gate gradually took shape, heavy and solid. I chose a design that opened inward, not extending into the public road. Every detail calculated. The night before it was completed, I received a call from the board member who had contacted me before. His voice was tense. He said the gate would anger many residents, that they were considering filing for an emergency injunction to halt construction. I asked him one question. Did they have a lawful easement? Silence lingered on the other end of the line for several seconds. On Monday morning, at 7:15, the gate closed for the first time. The sound of metal meeting metal rang out with certainty. Only 10 minutes later, the first SUV from the subdivision sped down the slope, braked hard. Stopped in front of the gate, the driver stepped out, staring at the keypad without understanding what was happening. Then another car. And another. Within 20 minutes, 8 vehicles were lined up outside the gate. On the inside, a few cars that had already entered the driveway found themselves trapped. There was no shouting, no pushing, only confusion. The president appeared again, this time without confidence. She demanded that I open the gate due to an emergency situation. I asked whether she had any legal document authorizing use of the driveway. There was none. 15 minutes later, a county patrol car arrived. Someone had called. The officer stepped out and asked what was going on. I handed him the gate permit, the boundary survey, and a copy of the complaint currently under review. He turned to the president and asked about the easement. She did not answer immediately. In that moment, I saw the complete reversal. The man once portrayed as the obstruction now stood firmly on legal ground. The representative of the collective had not a single valid document in her hand. The officer stated clearly that this was private property, and that the owner had the right to control access. The gate remained closed. The vehicles began turning around to find another route. I stood there, not celebrating, not gloating, feeling only one thing. When you know your boundaries clearly and have the courage to hold them, the world will be forced to adjust its direction. 7:20 in the morning, the slope in front of my gate turned into an unintended parking lot. and for the first time, the inconvenience no longer belonged to me. Car horns sounded in short bursts, not loud, but enough for tension to seep into the cold morning air. Shiny SUVs and brand-new pickup trucks lined up in front of the black steel gate that had just been completed. The gate stood there, silent, heavy, unmoved. A middle-aged man stepped out of his vehicle, looked up at the camera, then glanced around as if searching for an explanation. He was not angry, just confused. His wife remained inside the car, phone in hand, likely texting in the residents' group chat. On the other side of the gate, 3 vehicles had already entered the driveway before it fully closed. Now, they were trapped between the space in front of my house and the old wooden fence. There was no way around. I stepped out onto the porch. I did not walk all the way down. I simply stood and observed. I knew what would happen next. 10 minutes later, my phone vibrated. Not the president. Another resident. His voice was urgent, edged with frustration. He asked if I could temporarily open the gate so people could get to work on time. I asked him one question. Had he signed any document granting the HOA permission to use my driveway? He fell silent, then sighed. I told him the gate had been installed legally, and I could not open it simply because someone had grown accustomed to using something that did not belong to them. In his voice, I heard the conflict. On one side, daily convenience. On the other, legal principle he had never cared about until it directly affected him. Around 7:30, the president arrived. This time she was not alone. 2 board members came with her. Their faces no longer carried the firmness they had shown in the meeting room. She approached the gate and called my name. I walked down the slope, keeping my distance. No fence separated us, only the air between us. She said the situation was seriously impacting residents, that I should consider opening the gate while both sides continued negotiations, that my actions were creating unnecessary tension. I looked at her. I saw the fatigue beneath her makeup. I saw the pressure resting on her shoulders from behind. Residents were waiting for a solution. The board was waiting for her to manage the crisis. I said clearly that this gate was not a weapon. It was a boundary, and boundaries do not open simply because others have become used to stepping over them. One of the board members cut in. He said if I continued keeping the gate closed, the HOA would file for an emergency order to force me to open it. I nodded. Said I was prepared for that hearing as well. What they did not know was that the night before, my attorney had sent a formal notice to the HOA demanding the immediate cessation of all trespassing activities. If not, we would file a civil lawsuit seeking damages for unauthorized use of my property over the past period. I had never mentioned this publicly. The president sensed something. Her expression shifted. She asked if I truly wanted to take this to court. I answered that I did not want to, but I was ready. In that moment, I felt the balance of power tip completely. Not because I raised my voice, but because I did not waver. A car near the back began to turn around. Then another followed. The small metal chain on the gate trembled lightly in the wind, like a steady heartbeat in the middle of chaos. Around 8 o'clock, the slope in front of my house gradually cleared. The vehicles found alternate routes through the longer main road. Maybe they would choose 10 minutes, maybe more, but they would remember this morning. The president stood still for a final few seconds before leaving. In her eyes, there was no longer defiance, only a question. Why would I not step back? She did not know that for years, I had learned how to stand firm while everything around me shifted. I was used to being underestimated. People saw gray hair and thought weakness. They saw an old wooden house and thought isolation. They did not see experience. They did not see preparation. When the gate closed behind the last vehicle, I turned and walked back inside. No cheering. No loud victory. Just the quiet returning. And in that quiet, I knew one thing. From this day forward, they would no longer see me as a minor obstacle on their path to development. They would see me as the one holding the key. They called the police to force me to open the gate. And when the patrol car pulled up in front of my house, many people thought that was the moment I lost. The red and blue lights were not flashing. but its presence alone was enough to draw curtains aside in several houses across the hill. I could see silhouettes standing behind glass windows, waiting to see what would happen. The officer stepped out. He was not rushed, not tense, just professional. The president stood beside her car, arms crossed, her expression a mix of anger and hope that this time, authority would stand on her side. I opened the small pedestrian gate and walked out to meet the officer. I greeted him calmly. He asked if I could explain the situation. The president cut in before I could answer. She said I was deliberately obstructing temporary community traffic, creating a safety risk, and refusing to cooperate in resolving the dispute. I did not interrupt her. When she finished speaking, I handed the officer copies of the gate construction permit, the boundary survey, and a copy of the complaint currently under review by the county. I explained that this was private property, and there was no legal easement granting the HOA the right to use the driveway. The officer reviewed each document, slowly, carefully. In that moment, I sensed a subtle shift in the air. Not in me. In the president. She stopped talking so much. The officer turned to her and asked if she could provide documentation proving the right to use the driveway. She said the board had voted, that it was for the common good, that the land had once been proposed for integration into the internal traffic plan. A proposal is not an approval, the officer replied. A simple sentence, but enough. I noticed several residents gathering not far away. They whispered among themselves. They no longer looked at me with the accusatory eyes I had seen the previous morning. They looked at the president, waiting for a clear answer. There was none. The officer stated plainly that without a legal easement or a court order, the property owner had the right to control access to his property. He emphasized that this was a civil matter, not a criminal one. The gate remained closed. The president took a deep breath. I could clearly see the disappointment rising in her eyes. Not because of the gate, but because the image of authority she had built in front of the community was beginning to crack. One of the board members stepped closer and whispered something to her. I could not hear the words, but I saw the concern etched across his face. They were beginning to understand that this was no longer a game confined to the HOA meeting room. It had stepped beyond the boundaries they controlled. The officer asked me whether I intended to provoke or endanger residents. I replied that I was simply protecting my lawful property and had given notice multiple times beforehand. He nodded and said he advised both sides to resolve the matter through attorneys or the court if necessary. When the patrol car drove away, there was no applause, no cheering, only a thick silence. I looked toward the president. For the first time since this story began, she said nothing to me. No threats, no insinuations. She simply turned and walked back to her car. I knew what that meant. She had realized that I was not a lonely old man who could be pressured into submission. I was someone who understood the law, understood the system, and had enough patience to use their own rules against them. That afternoon, I received an email from the HOA. The message was shorter than any before. They proposed temporarily suspending use of the driveway while awaiting the county's review. Temporarily. I read the email and felt something unusual. Not victory, not satisfaction. Validation. Validation that when you stand firm on your principles, even systems that seem solid can begin to tremble. That evening, I stood in front of the steel gate, my hand resting on the cold metal surface. Across the hill, lights in the subdivision flickered on one by one. Their lives continued. And so did mine, with only one difference. Now they understood that this gate was not made of steel alone. It was made of resolve. 2 weeks later, the county sent an official notice to the HOA, and within a single afternoon, the entire subdivision grew unusually quiet. I knew what had happened before their email arrived. The county inspector had called me that morning. His voice was calm but clear. He said they had reviewed the original project approval file, and there was one important detail the HOA board had not mentioned in any meeting. The subdivision had been approved on the condition that no access routes outside the registered property boundaries would be used. Any changes required a formal amendment application and written approval from the county. No such application had ever been submitted. In other words, their use of my driveway was not merely a civil dispute. It was a violation of the project's approval conditions. When I ended the call, I did not feel excitement. I felt a cold confirmation. I had been right. That afternoon, the HOA sent an email to every resident. The message acknowledged that the county required them to immediately cease using any access outside the approved plan. It also stated that they would need to invest in expanding the main eastern road to ensure proper traffic flow. I later heard that the estimated cost for that expansion was $120,000. That figure did not come from me. It came from the board itself during an emergency meeting. That evening, I drove past the subdivision, not to boast, simply to observe. The lights in the community clubhouse were still on. A meeting was underway. Through the glass windows, I saw the president standing in front of a whiteboard, her expression tense. A resident raised his hand, his voice clearly louder than usual. I could not hear the words, but I could read the gestures. Frustration, anger, doubt. They once believed I was the problem. Now they were beginning to ask a different question. Who had told them that access was legal? The next morning, I received another letter from the HOA. This time, it was not a threat. It was a formal notice acknowledging that my driveway was private property and would not be used without a written agreement. An agreement. They no longer spoke of common good. No longer of collective authority. They spoke of agreement. In that moment, I understood something. Real power does not lie in forcing others to submit. It lies in making them respect your boundaries. That afternoon, a man from the subdivision knocked on my door. He looked to be in his early 60s. He held his hat in his hand, his eyes sincere. He said he had not known the full story. He apologized for thinking I had been intentionally difficult. I invited him onto the porch. We sat down together, looking toward the slope that now lay quiet. He said many residents were unhappy with how the board had handled the situation. They did not want conflict. They simply wanted to live in peace. I told him I wanted the same. None of us wanted a war over a driveway. But wars begin when one side believes it can take what does not belong to it without asking. He nodded. A few days later, I heard that the president had announced she would not seek re-election in the next voting cycle. There was no official explanation, just a brief notice in the internal newsletter. I do not know whether she regretted her actions. Perhaps she believed she was acting for the common good. Perhaps she thought I was too rigid. But the truth was simpler than that. They had misjudged the man living on the hill. They saw age and assumed weakness. They saw silence and assumed compliance. They did not see the years I had spent learning how to hold my ground under pressure. That morning, I opened the small pedestrian gate and walked down the slope. There were no fresh tire tracks, no clouds of dust, only gravel resting quietly under the sunlight. I stood there for a long while. Not to celebrate, but to remember the feeling of a boundary being respected, the feeling of quiet resolve, overcoming loud imposition. And I knew that even though life on the other side of the hill would go on, they would never look at this slope the same way again. It was no longer a shortcut. It was a lesson. One morning, I opened the gate and left it open for a full hour. No one drove through. The slope lay still beneath the early sunlight. No fresh tire marks, no hurried engines, no headlights sweeping across my living room windows at dawn. That quiet was something I once always had. Then it was taken from me, little by little, by people who believed their convenience mattered more than my boundaries. Now the quiet had returned. I brewed my coffee, sat down on the porch, and looked toward the subdivision beyond the line of pine trees. The newly built houses still shimmered under the sun. Their lives went on. Children rode their bikes. Adults mowed their lawns. Cars moved in and out along the newly expanded main road. But one thing had changed. No one saw this slope as a shortcut anymore. A week after the county issued its final notice, I received a letter from the newly elected HOA board. It was not a threat, not a demand. It was a request for dialogue. They wrote that they wanted to build a respectful relationship with neighboring property owners. They acknowledged that previous mistakes had created unnecessary tension. I read the letter slowly. Perhaps they wrote it under pressure. Perhaps because of the lesson that came with the $120,000 cost of the new road. Perhaps because they understood that a multi-million-dollar project should not be shaken by a driveway only a few meters wide. But to me, that no longer mattered. What mattered was that they had learned to ask before stepping across. That afternoon, I walked down the slope again. I looked at the steel stakes marking the boundary, still standing firm. I remembered the morning the gate closed for the first time. I remembered the irritated stares, the challenging voices in the meeting room. I do not hate the former president. I think she believed she was acting for the common good, but she forgot something simple. The common good cannot be built by erasing one person's private rights. They once saw me as a lonely old man clinging to the past. They did not know that I had managed projects far more complex, that I had sat in meeting rooms where decisions affected entire cities, that I had learned how not to yield when principles were crossed. I do not boast about that. I do not need to. True power does not lie in titles. It lies in the ability to stand firm under pressure. That evening, I walked up the hill behind my house. The wind moved through the pine trees, carrying the scent of soil and damp grass. I looked down at the subdivision as its lights came on. Warm yellow light stretched across the landscape like a peaceful painting. I thought about everything that had happened. The tense meetings, the threatening letters, the metallic sound of the gate closing, the officer's expression when he asked about the easement. Each of those moments was a choice. I could have stayed silent and accepted it. I could have opened the gate for convenience. I could have told myself that a few cars were not worth the trouble. But if I had done that, I would have taught them that boundaries can be pushed back little by little. And once you allow that to happen, you do not just lose a driveway. You lose the right to decide over your own land. I returned home as the sky grew fully dark. The steel gate made a soft sound as I closed it, not to keep anyone out, but to remind myself that boundaries must always be protected. If you have ever lived in an HOA community, if you have ever felt dismissed because of your age or your silence, remember this. Strength is not always loud. Sometimes, it is simply a man standing at his own gate and saying no. If this story resonates with you, share your experience in the comments. I read every line, and if you believe stories about boundaries and quiet resolve deserve to be told more often, press like and subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Here, we are not looking for conflict. We are looking for respect.